So in this next clip, I deal with what I termed the augmented Southern strategy. And I think it perfectly encapsulates the use of identity politics to suppress progressivism and to suppress conversations about class. And I use the example of David Brock, who really unleashed the hounds of hell towards identity politics, or using identity politics against Bernie Sanders. So in this next clip, I unpack the augmented Southern strategy, and I want to get your feedback. What do you think? This is something I pointed out months ago, and now we see it coming to fruition. All right, so check out this clip and tell me what you think.
Which brings me to the conversation about the augmented Southern strategy. Because when we make everything, when we stop the conversation at race, we are completely incapable of having the conversation about the economic structure. And it goes both ways. White supremacy created racism so that poor white people would never pay attention to the reality that they were poor, not because of black people, but they were poor because of the manner in which we play capitalism, zero-sum game. But also this fear of anything and everybody being racist that has been fed to the black community from the Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment, Hillary Clinton et al., David Brock, and the rest of the Get Along gang, and even some very select black political elite who want to turn your attention and say Bernie Sanders is a racist. And so long as they can just convince you for a split second that Bernie Sanders is a racist, you miss the forest for the trees. And you stop and you never go and explore the conversation about the fundamental structure of our capitalistic system in America. You stop at race. And so white people, Republicans, are using the race card to get their voters to never have a conversation about economics. And then white people and black people on the Democratic, on left-leaning side will keep you from ever having a conversation about economics. What do they have in common? They have in common the joy and the satisfaction that they're doing okay in this current economic paradigm, and they don't have any vested interest in seeing it change. That, my friends, is the establishment. Whether it is Republican or whether it's Democratic, there is an establishment for which both parties benefit. But they know they can spook black people into thinking Bernie Sanders is a racist. And again, I could care less if it was Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. At this point, it could be Jill Stein. At this point, it could be, hell, I was going to say Krugman, but he's good in establishment now. It could be Robert Reich. Can it just be somebody who is bold enough to take on the office of the presidency and fight against those fundamental forces that is shaping the presidency to always serve neoliberal zero-sum capitalism and serve the military industrial complex? But David Brock takes Bernie Sanders' ad today and he does the augmented Southern strategy. And he says Bernie Sanders doesn't care. Apparently, black lives don't matter to Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders ran a demographically accurate ad in Iowa showing pretty much the percentage, the ratio of black to white to minorities in Iowa. But because we did not count and have enough black faces in this ad, that means Bernie Sanders is a racist and he doesn't like black people and he has a minority problem. And you know what? You've got some black people dumb enough to believe that. I would apologize for what I just said, but it's out there now. Who the hell cares? And you have some black people manipulative enough to play on that. And you have some black media voices who are manipulative enough to seize on that. And they run with it and they tweet and they write their think pieces. They write their thought pieces about the problems that Bernie Sanders has with minorities, when in reality, Bernie Sanders doesn't have a problem with minorities. Bernie Sanders has a problem with the Democratic establishment. But racism. And so now they have precluded any conversation on the issue of economic structure, which is the fundamental thing, keep the fundamental framework in which we exist, which determines whether or not black or white, if your butt could ever get out of poverty, or if your behind could ever get out of living paycheck to paycheck. But racism. And the same thing is true on the other side of the equation, right? The same thing is true on the Republican side of the equation. They can always distract their voters from ever paying attention to the fundamental structure, to the reality that the fundamental structure is the problem, because reverse racism, because black people are lazy, because black people want welfare, and Hispanics wants your job. You know, they want that job that you want so desperately to pick tomatoes. When in actuality, companies have a vested interest in obtaining as much cheap, illegal immigrant labor as possible, because they don't have any responsibility to pay them the minimum wage. And it all boils back down to capital versus labor. I'm not a far left socialist in the sense that I think capitalism has to be brought down. David Brock plays this augmented race card, the same augmented Southern strategy that Hillary Clinton played at the debates, where she tried to convince everybody that Bernie Sanders doesn't like or support your first black president, South Carolina. And because Bernie Sanders doesn't like and support your first black president, you should come run into my arms. Never mind the fact that my economic paradigm represents the status quo, which means what you got now is what you're going to get. You see how race is used on both sides of the equation to sustain the status quo? And the status quo is full exposure of labor to the economic forces of a globalized economy. I've got ideas, but that's not important. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of great ideas. The problem is, do we have someone who's willing to take those ideas and slowly but surely, we don't need a Bolshevik revolution. We don't need a proletariat violent revolution. We need fundamental change in the way we approach capitalism. I think Robert Reich's book, I haven't read it yet, but if the title gives any idea into the premise of the book, Saving Capitalism for Itself, from Itself, then I think he's got the idea. I'm not giving a plug. I don't get paid, don't even know him other than what I read. But the title itself is that you have to save it from itself. And so we've allowed racism. We've allowed racism on both sides right now to be, it's been happening in the Republican Party for at least 40, 50 years, right? Since 1950, 60 years, right? It's been happening a long time over there. But now the Democratic Party they're masters, the establishment, they are masters of spooking you from considering the one person who is having the conversation that needs to be had about the fundamental structure of our system. The reason you have to be in that top 4% of talent and opportunity and luck to get escape velocity out of poverty. But David Brock thinks that, Bernie Sanders don't think Black Lives Matter because he didn't have the right number of black people in his ad. Augmented Southern strategy. We hear the dog whistles and you're just trying to pit black people against a white man playing racism, playing the race card. Hillary Clinton, same thing. Bernie Sanders doesn't support President Obama. She won't say that in any other primary state. But when she got to South Carolina, because she knows she cannot afford to lose her stranglehold on the black vote, she decides to play Bernie Sanders against President Obama. Augmented Southern strategy. And then the straight out Southern strategy from Republicans, all to keep us from talking about the economic status quo. I want to play this on my show from Hillary Clinton because of their augmented dog whistle, augmented Southern strategy. They have been malicious in this week. I mean, they have been vicious with trying to convince people that Bernie Sanders is a racist, when in actuality, the story is a little different. And let me see if I can get this to play from my Facebook channel. Bernie Sanders in the 90s.
I've got a problem with a president and a Congress which allows 5 million children to go hungry, 2 million people to sleep out on the streets, cities to become breeding grounds for drugs and violence. And they say, we're getting tough on crime. If you want to get tough on crime, let's deal with the causes of crime. Let's demand that every man, woman, and child in this country have a decent opportunity and a decent standard of living. Let's not keep putting poor people into jail and disproportionately punishing blacks.
Hillary Clinton in the 90s.
Not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
And so that you're not mistaken, she said heel, H-E-E-L, as if they were dogs. We had to make them heel before we could address their issues. All right, I wanted to play that.
Gangs of kids anymore.
Hush, Hillary, hush. I wanted to play that because this idea that somehow Bernie Sanders is a racist because he didn't put enough black people in his commercial, as opposed to Hillary Clinton's rhetoric on super predators, which contributed to the war on crime and the war on drugs, which disproportionately affected minorities, especially poor minorities.